This is America Daily, bringing you the best in truthful news updates and in-depth reports happening now.
Welcome to America Daily. I'm Jessica Beatty. America's founding fathers agreed on a set of values that form the basis of our American experiment. They believed that our rights come from God, not the government, and that all political power comes from we the people. The founders set up a limited government in the form of a representative republic because they did not trust a direct democracy and likened it to mob rule. They also believed in a written constitution and private property rights. But today, the United States is at a crossroads. Our 2020 Democrat candidates are embracing socialist policies that are not in line with America's founding principles. And according to a recent survey by the victims of communism, 70% of millennials are likely to vote socialist, and 1 in 3 millennials have a positive view of communism. It's been over 100 years since Russia's Bolshevik Revolution in 1917. Today, we start a special series about Soviet communism. In order to understand how it has impacted us today, we have to go back to the beginning. On today's show, we cover how the Bolsheviks took power in 1917, and we also have a special interview with a woman who spent her formative years in the USSR. Here's Mark Jackson reading an excerpt from the Epoch Times series, How the Specter of Communism is Ruling Our World. He covers the rise of the Soviet communists and the slaughter of the working class.
In February 1917, food shortages and deteriorating working conditions drove Russian industrial workers to go on strike. As the turmoil spread across the country, Tsar Nicholas II stepped down from the throne, and the Russian Provisional Government was established. Learning of these events, Vladimir Lenin immediately returned to Russia from exile in Switzerland. At the time, World War I was raging. The countries between Russia and Switzerland were all hostile. In late 2007, the German magazine Der Spiegel revealed a 90-year-old secret. Kaiser Wilhelm II, who regarded Russia as a grave threat, realized that Lenin could bring disaster to Russia, so he allowed Lenin to travel through Germany to Sweden, then Finland, and eventually back to Russia. Wilhelm II also provided money and munitions to Lenin. By the end of 1917, Lenin had received 2.6 million marks from Germany. Winston Churchill had this to say about Germany's role in Lenin's return. They used the most lethal weapon in Russia. They shipped Lenin back in a tightly sealed truck, as if shipping a type of plague virus to Russia. Lenin carried out a coup on November 7, 1917, or October 25 by the traditional Julian calendar. With the October Revolution, Lenin overthrew the provisional government and established the world's first communist regime. But in the democratic election for the Russian Constituent Assembly, the Party of Socialist Revolutionaries, SRs, won a majority of national votes over Lenin's Bolshevik Party, which controlled the government administration. Out of an electorate of 44.4 million people, 40% voted for the SRs, with the Bolsheviks losing by a 20% margin. After this setback, in the Russian Constituent Assembly meeting on January 5, 1918, Lenin trampled on his promises and declared the Constituent Assembly an, quote, enemy of the people. Having prepared in advance to enact martial law on the day of the Assembly's meeting in the Russian capital of Petrograd, the Bolsheviks mobilized troops and disbanded the Constituent Assembly by force, destroying the democratic process in Russia. The October Revolution and subsequent Leninist takeover was the origin of all violent communist movements throughout the world in the 20th century. It triggered the international rise of communism and the countless catastrophes that followed. From Marx's theories to the rhetoric of the totalitarian communist regimes, all were filled with the principle of reliance on the proletarian workers and peasants and promises to represent their interests. But in practice, it was the working class that suffered the greatest abuses under the communist system. A. Suppressing the Soviet workers and peasants. In 1918, after Lenin illegally disbanded the Constituent Assembly, it was the workers who were the first to resist the communist dictatorship. Protesting the dissolution of the assembly, tens of thousands of workers from Petrograd and Moscow held parades and demonstrations. Bolshevik soldiers cracked down on the unrest with lethal force, gunning down demonstrators and filling the streets of Petrograd and Moscow with the workers' blood. The country's largest labor union, the All-Russian Union of Railwaymen, announced a strike to protest the Bolshevik coup and gained the broad support of many other labor organizations. As it did with the workers of Petrograd and Moscow, the Communist Party of the Soviet Union put down the strikers with its armed forces, and the All-Russian Union and other independent unions were banned. Remaining labor organizations were gradually forced under the control of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. In the spring of 1919, starving workers in cities across Russia went on strike several times to demand the same rations as Red Army soldiers, the rights to free speech and democratic elections, and the abolition of political privileges afforded to the communists. All these movements were handled by the Cheka secret police, who jailed or shot the strikers. In the summer of 1918, Russia faced a massive food shortage due to the ongoing civil war. In June, with the country on the verge of famine, Lenin dispatched Joseph Stalin to Tsaritsyn to seize grain from the Volga Basin, traditionally a breadbasket of Russian agriculture. The tyranny of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union invited resistance from the peasants. In August 1918, peasants in the Penza region rose up in an armed revolt, and the uprising quickly spread to the surrounding areas. The Communist Party of the Soviet Union sent troops to suppress the uprisings, and Lenin sent a telegram to the Penza Bolsheviks. Here is British historian Robert Service's translation of the original Russian telegram. Hang, and make sure the hanging takes place in full view of the people. No fewer than 100 known landlords, rich men, bloodsuckers. Publish their names. Seize all their grain from them. Designate hostages in accordance with yesterday's telegram. Do it in such a fashion that for hundreds of kilometers around, the people might see, tremble, know, shout. Before the October Revolution, Tambov was one of the richest provinces in Russia. In order to seize its grain, the Soviet Union organized many, quote, grain requisitioning teams and sent them to the region. Over 50,000 Tambov farmers formed local militias to fight the Communist Party of the Soviet Union's requisitioning teams. In June 1921, faced with the task of suppressing the Tambov rebellion, the Soviet regime suggested that military commander Mikhail Tukhachevsky fight the hooligans with poison gas. Tukhachevsky's use of chemical weapons, combined with fires that burned across the region, rendered much of Tambov completely desolate. An estimated 100,000 Tambov peasants who took part in the resistance and their relatives were imprisoned or exiled. Around 15,000 people died in the insurgency. The widespread slaughter in the Soviet Union served as a comprehensive model for the Chinese Communist Party's coming persecution of the Chinese workers and peasants.
Next up is Vanessa Rios Gomez and her interview with a woman who has firsthand experience of what it was like to live under Soviet communism.
I'm Vanessa Rios Gomez. Welcome to America Daily. According to records by the United States Congress, communism has brought untimely deaths to well over 100 million people over the last century through famine, war, political killings, torture, and genocide, to name a few. Where communism promised equal rights, strong social welfare from cradle to the grave, as well as sharing everything equally to an extreme level, it instead created societies where power is held by small vicious groups that enslave entire nations. In those societies, killing fields, gulags, and re-education through labor camps became a part of the everyday norm. In the century since its creation, communism has proven to be a failure in every nation that it has taken root in. Communism assigns humans the same value as cattle. It encourages severe jealousy of your neighbor, and when mixing those two views, killing human beings becomes an ordinary task. Children grow up in constant fear, learning early on, if they want to survive, their allegiance must first be to the regime, not their faith, family, or their conscience. But the economic failures, mass killings, and slave nations created by communism are not the biggest crimes of the system. The biggest crime of communism is its destruction of the human soul. For communism, although claiming it is atheist, replaces faith in God with worship of the Communist Party. Today we welcome Yulia Tuller on our show. She grew up in the Soviet Union and immigrated to the United States in the late 90s. She'll be sharing some insights on how communism affected her and her family, and how she's still affected today, choosing to proactively remove years of communist propaganda and brainwashing from her thinking. Yulia, how are you?
I'm fine, thanks.
Perhaps you can give our listeners a brief introduction about yourself.
Yeah, thanks for having me on America Daily. So I was born in Soviet Union in 1971 in a small town called Priozersk in the Republic of Kazakhstan. My birth name is Yulia Valerievna Zhirnova. My father is a retired Air Force engineer, and my mother was a human resource manager. So we relocated to a different city, Samara City on the Volga River when I was about 10, so in the 4th grade. And as a child of a military family, I likely had a slightly more affluent upbringing than average Russian, but of course I didn't know that at the time. Meanwhile, my mother seemed to entertain the idea that life might be better overseas. After the fall of Soviet Union in 1989, I began to contemplate the possibility of actually leaving the country. And in 1998, when I was 24, I got married to an American and immigrated to rural Wisconsin. Needless to say, it was a completely different world. So at first, I had a tendency to glorify the country of my birth and almost subconsciously assume things were much better in Russia than in America. Like the food tasted better or the people were kinder, that sort of stuff. So, however, a few years after my daughter was born, I traveled back to Russia to visit family and discovered how wrong I was. I could see how America was the way better and began to understand how many lies in Russian government still fed to people. For example, it was widely believed that Americans were all imperialist pigs that were stupid and with poor education. I knew them, especially those rural folks in Wisconsin, to be the salt of the earth or, super kind, wonderful people. I mean, strangers who would give you the shirt off their back. So after living in the U.S. for 20 years and having access to much more information than the average Russian, especially with our uncensored internet here, I am now better able to reflect on the lies they taught me in my youth and what's much more likely the truth. Like I remember finally being able to read George Orwell's book, 1984, which I had never heard of in Russia, and it shook me to the core.
Can you tell me more about that?
I think I was here for about 10 years, and I was traveling. A friend of mine and I went to Wisconsin, Door County. We went for a weekend. And while I was there, I like to talk to people. I love American people. I think they're absolutely friendly and fabulous, and they have all these great stories to tell. So I always make sure that I talk to people just to find out who they are and where they come from, because there's such an eclectic array of people here. And so I was in the shoe store, and we were talking to the owner, and then she invited us afterwards to come and join her for dinner. So we did. We came there, and she had a roommate who was running a restaurant. As we were discussing different things, he asked me where I was from, and I told him I'm from Russia. He says, "Have you ever read 1984 by George Orwell?" I said, "Never heard of it." He says, "Oh, I must give you a copy." So he gave me a copy of the book. And I took the book, I came home, and I started reading right away. And it was such a transformative experience. I couldn't put the book down. I had to read it from cover to cover, and I think I read the whole thing in 2 days. I just swallowed it. And you have to understand, English is a second language, so I'm a slow reader. But I couldn't put it down. I had to read it. And when I was done and I closed the book, I had this physical revelation in my body. I started to shake. And all of a sudden, I realized what had happened to my family in Russia, my grandparents, my parents, how evil it was to, excuse me.
Yes.
It was this physical sensation to understand what actually happened. For the first time in my entire life, it was really difficult, and it was very emotional, and I was just shaken to the core. And I think that was the beginning of my spiritual journey of uncovering things that had sort of had happened to my grandparents, my parents, myself. And it's kind of like, it's almost like this, you have this mental illness and you live in an environment that is so vicious and so evil that as a child, you just learn to ignore it. You don't allow yourself to feel it. You don't allow yourself to have any emotions, any feelings about it. You don't think about it. You just live there and you make it do because that's what your life is. And you don't know any different. But then so many years later, now being in the United States, it started to unravel. And I allow myself to go through this sort of process of understanding deeply and deeply every time what had happened, so that I can help myself and I can help other people to see that. Last year I had this thought, is I was talking to someone and they were complaining about an immigrant and how these immigrants come here to the United States and they don't understand what's happening here. And so they do things that they're not supposed to. And I thought of that. Then I said to this woman, I said, I think what's happening is these immigrants, especially immigrants that come from Russia, from China, from Cuba, from Korea, those are poisoned the most by this communist evil ideology that penetrates every aspect. It didn't miss anyone. It just destroyed and penetrated every aspect of a human psyche, of a human being, that when they come here, they don't really know what the history is in their country. They don't really know what they are anymore. And oftentimes, they create this Chinatown and Russian town, or they have groups where they feel comfortable because they sort of act on their notions of how they used to be in their own country, their food, their customs and ideas of how it is. But actually, it's not like that. But they don't know the truth. Because, see, for me, what happened is when I came to this country, I ended up in the middle of nowhere in Wisconsin, among the cow fields and farmers, and nobody knew Russian. I had no friends that spoke Russian. So I was sort of forced by the divine power to be submerged completely in the American culture so I can learn the language, so I can learn the culture, I can understand this, and I think I went through some sort of withdrawal that was physical, psychological, cultural, and every level, where I was letting go of all the things that I thought I was, and I thought I was supposed to be, and how I was supposed to act and think and do things. That it helped me to sort of get rid of all that, this heavy weight that I've learned I thought I was in my country, in my home country, and that was helpful for me. But a lot of people who come here, they don't. They stay in their groups. They never change.
So Yulia, can you give us a little background about your family and where you come from?
When I was 15 years old, I think I was 15 or 14 or 15, so I was a teenager, right? And now you have to understand, I'm a third generation. So I have my grandparents who were born around Civil War, so right after the Russian Revolution. And I can only imagine this was a horrible time. And then you have my parents. So my father is born in right before the war started it. And my mother, so 1941, and my mother born in 1951, so 10 years later after World War II ended. And you're dealing with a generation of people who are scared, brainwashed, and completely confused. I mean, they're completely confused about everything. So during the Russian Revolution, what happens is all the patriarchs and matriarchs who knew the tradition, the morals, the agriculture, all these things, they get murdered. They get slaughtered. They get slaughtered by Lenin. They get slaughtered by Stalin. So millions die. So Lenin, during a time that Lenin was ruling the country and was in power, he, even during the Civil War that followed revolution, right? There's so many millions died. Then you have Stalin who comes in and he just decides to slaughter millions of people and gains unconditional rule over the country and instills such a fear that I remember when I was talking to my grandmother, my mother's mom, Alexandra, and she looked at me and I said, Grandma, I want to know, what were your parents? What were your grandparents? Can you tell me about it? And she says, no, I can't. Don't ever ask me. So it was like a no topic. So yesterday, out of curiosity, I reached out to my mother and I said, Mom, I'd like to ask you a question. What was the names and the dates of birth and all that of the grandparents, your grandparents, my dad's grandparents? She says, we have no information and we have no way to find out. And don't ask me that again.
Oh.
And we're living in 2019.
So you do think that they fear that they're being listened to?
I think it's not a fear of being listened to. I think it's just this brainwashing is so deeply affected that generation that it would be odd for any American just to think about, well, I want to know who the grandparents were of my parents. It would be an absolutely normal question to be asked. But no, it's not. For many Russian people, it's just non-existent. It's like it doesn't even exist. So they weren't there. You don't ask about that. And that part of history is wiped, not only for the country, but also for the families, inside the families. So my family tree stops at my grandparents. Actually starts there.
We have a good idea of what you think of communism. What do you think of socialism?
People have this illusion that socialism is good because, Americans never lived in those countries. They don't know how bad it is there.
Can you give an example of something that happened to you that is not typical and would not typically happen to someone, say, growing up in the United States, but was kind of common for where you were from?
We were living in Priazorsk, Kazakhstan, which was the military base. And so my father would go for about 2 or 3 weeks at a time and then serve and do his business at work. And then he'd come back for a weekend or for a couple of days and go back there. And my mom, at that time, she was young and she was working as a secretary for one of the military bases. And one time, her and her another friend secretary from another base decided to go to get a haircut during lunchtime. And so they went and they got their haircuts and they chatted about this and chatted about that. And another secretary shared that there's a new division of young officers is being shipped to the base. And so soon, and she was so excited about it, and soon they're going to have new exciting faces, new officers come, walking around, and there would be a fresh wave for their establishment. And so they kind of laughed about it, made jokes and so forth. And then so my mom, and that was the end of it. And so they both went back to work. When my mother came back to work, about 10 minutes or so later, she was summoned up by KGB. And they put her in a room with the light in her eye, just like you read in the books. And they start asking her questions. They said, well, what is your name? This and that. What is your, what is your profession here? What are you doing? So forth. And then how did you find out about these new division of officers that are about to arrive to the base? And she says, well, very innocently, that my friend, the other secretary, told her that story, and she doesn't really know where she found out about it. She didn't question. She just knows they're coming. And they said, well, is it your husband told you this? She says, no, my husband didn't tell me anything. They said, well, your husband is an officer, and he's in I guess at that time, maybe he was part of some sort of division where it's locked, so it's secret information. Nobody's allowed to access it. And she says, no. And so she tells me this story that she's being questioned by KGB, and she was so brave to tell them that I tell them the truth. I didn't lie to them. And on the end, they start to recruit her to spy on her husband. And I asked her, okay, so how did you? And she says, oh, no, I would never do that. I told them straightforward, no, I'm not going to ever spy on my husband. And many years went by, and there, I think I was when I came to America, and I reflected on that conversation that I had with my mother, and I thought, but did she? How do I know? So it's hard for any American, I think, to understand the extent of how evil and vile this Communist Party really is. It is everywhere. I often think it took me many years to just reflect back and see myself and just see that these communism is like this tar, is attached to cells in my body. And when often I have conversations about that, it's just I feel like this is part of my skin, and only people who went through such experiences, can really truly understand what it means to live in a country that is run by communism and by these lies. And you get so disillusioned, you have no idea what was really your past, what is really true.
Thank you so much, Yulia, for joining us.
And thank you for inviting me.
We hope you enjoyed today's show. Stay tuned as we continue this series on Soviet communism. Once again, I'm Jessica Beatty. Thanks for listening to America Daily. Until next time.
This is America Daily, bringing you the best in truthful news updates and in-depth reports happening now.